The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte walked briskly along the cobblestone path, her mind racing with thoughts that seemed to weigh heavier than the royal tiara she would one day wear. At 17, she carried herself with the poise expected of a future queen, but behind her composed exterior lurked anxieties that no amount of royal training could have prepared her for. Charlotte had always been different from her brothers. Where Prince George embraced his future role with quiet acceptance, and Prince Louis approached royal duties with characteristic humor, Charlotte questioned everything. She wondered about the lives of ordinary people, about freedom, about choices that seemed so simple for others but remained forever out of her reach. These thoughts had been growing stronger lately, creating a storm of confusion that threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed royal facade. The palace corridors echoed with her hurried footsteps as she made her way to the morning briefing room. The walls, adorned with portraits of ancestors who had faced their own challenges, seemed to watch her with knowing eyes. Each painting told a story of duty, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the crown. But Charlotte found herself wondering if any of them had ever felt as lost as she did in this moment. Her private secretary, Mrs. Henderson, waited in the briefing room with the day's schedule neatly arranged on the mahogany table. The elderly woman had served the royal family for over 2 decades and possessed an uncanny ability to read the moods of her charges. As Charlotte entered, Mrs. Henderson immediately noticed the slight tremor in the princess's hands and the way her eyes darted nervously around the room. The schedule was packed with the usual array of royal engagements: a visit to a children's hospital, a ceremony at the local university, and an evening gala for a charity close to the royal family's heart. Each event represented hours of careful preparation, rehearsed conversations, and the constant pressure to represent the monarchy with grace and dignity. Charlotte listened to the briefing, but her mind wandered to thoughts of what her life might have been like if she had been born into any other family. During the hospital visit preparation meeting, Charlotte found herself struggling to focus as the staff outlined the protocols she needed to follow. There would be cameras everywhere, capturing her every expression and gesture for the world to analyze. The children they would visit were battling serious illnesses, and Charlotte genuinely wanted to bring them comfort and joy, but she felt overwhelmed by the weight of expectation surrounding even this act of compassion. The Royal Protection Team, led by Sergeant Major Williams, reviewed the security arrangements for the day. Williams had been assigned to Charlotte's detail for 3 years and had developed a protective instinct toward the young princess that went beyond professional duty. He noticed how she had become increasingly withdrawn in recent weeks, often lost in thought and seemingly burdened by concerns she couldn't share with anyone around her. As the morning progressed, Charlotte retreated to her private study, a sanctuary filled with books that offered her glimpses into worlds beyond palace walls. She had always been an avid reader, drawn to stories of adventure and independence that felt so far removed from her own reality. The latest novel on her desk told the tale of a young woman who left everything behind to pursue her dreams, and Charlotte found herself reading the same passages repeatedly, imagining what such freedom might feel like. The princess's phone buzzed with messages from her school friends, most of whom were preparing for university applications and planning gap-year adventures that Charlotte could only dream about. While her peers debated between studying abroad or backpacking through Europe, Charlotte's future was already mapped out in royal engagements, state visits, and ceremonial duties that stretched decades into the future. The contrast between their excitement and her sense of confinement had never felt more stark. Around midday, Charlotte received an unexpected visit from her grandmother's former lady-in-waiting, Lady Margaret Thornfield, who had known the royal family intimately for over 40 years. Lady Margaret possessed a warmth and wisdom that had always comforted Charlotte during difficult times. She sensed immediately that something was troubling the young princess and settled into the comfortable armchair across from Charlotte's desk, with the patient demeanor of someone who had weathered many royal storms. Their conversation began with pleasantries about Charlotte's studies and upcoming engagements, but Lady Margaret's perceptive questioning gradually drew out the princess's true concerns. Charlotte found herself speaking more openly than she had in months, sharing her fears about losing herself in the role she was destined to play, and her longing for experiences that seemed forever beyond her reach. Lady Margaret listened without judgment, offering gentle guidance drawn from decades of observing the delicate balance between personal happiness and royal duty. The afternoon brought an unexpected development that would set the events of the coming days into motion. Charlotte received a call from her former classmate Emma, who had always been one of her closest friends despite the vast difference in their circumstances. Emma was calling from her university dormitory, crying and in desperate need of someone to talk to. She had received devastating news about her family's financial situation and faced the possibility of dropping out of school just months before graduation. Charlotte listened to Emma's tearful explanation of how her father's business had collapsed, leaving the family unable to afford her remaining tuition fees. Emma had always been one of the few people who treated Charlotte as simply another friend rather than a royal figure, and their friendship had provided Charlotte with a precious connection to normal teenage life. The thought of losing this friendship, combined with her desire to help someone she cared about, created an emotional urgency that would soon lead to impulsive decisions. As evening approached, Charlotte found herself pacing her room, unable to concentrate on the briefing materials for the next day's engagements. The contrast between her own privileged but constrained existence and Emma's genuine crisis created a profound sense of helplessness that gnawed at her conscience. She had access to enormous wealth and resources through various royal funds and charitable organizations, but the protocols surrounding their use seemed impossibly complex and time-consuming when measured against Emma's immediate need. The princess's evening meal was served in her private dining room, but she barely touched the expertly prepared food. Her thoughts kept returning to Emma's distress and to broader questions about the purpose and relevance of royal life in the modern world. She wondered if the countless ceremonial duties and carefully choreographed public appearances actually made any meaningful difference in people's lives, or if they were simply elaborate performances designed to maintain an institution that had outlived its usefulness. After dinner, Charlotte attempted to work on her university preparation coursework, but found herself staring at the same page for nearly an hour without absorbing any information. The weight of expectation seemed to press down on her from all directions. The expectation to excel academically while maintaining a full schedule of royal duties, to represent the monarchy with unwavering dignity while still being a normal teenager, and to accept her predetermined future without question or complaint. As night fell over Kensington Palace, Charlotte stood at her bedroom window overlooking the gardens where she had walked that morning. The security lights illuminated the pathways and highlighted the high walls that separated the royal residence from the bustling city beyond. Those walls had always represented safety and privilege, but tonight they felt more like prison barriers, keeping her trapped in a life she wasn't sure she wanted to live. The princess's phone rang, breaking through her melancholy reflections. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and Charlotte answered immediately, hoping her friend had found some solution to her crisis. Instead, Emma's voice was even more distraught than before. The deadline for her next tuition payment had been moved up, and she now faced the prospect of being forced to withdraw from university within days rather than months. The urgency of the situation created a pressure that Charlotte felt in her chest like a physical weight. After the call ended, Charlotte sat on her bed, surrounded by the luxury and security that defined her world, feeling more isolated and powerless than ever before. The irony was not lost on her that someone born into such privilege could feel so helpless when faced with a friend's genuine need. The royal protocols that governed her life, designed to protect and guide her, suddenly felt like chains that prevented her from acting with the spontaneity and compassion that the situation demanded. Sleep eluded Charlotte that night as she lay awake considering options that all seemed to lead to complications and conflicts with royal protocol. The palace around her settled into its nighttime quiet, but her mind raced with plans and possibilities that grew more desperate as the hours passed. By dawn, she had reached a decision that would challenge everything she had been taught about duty, protocol, and the careful boundaries that separated royal life from the ordinary world beyond the palace walls. The decision forming in Charlotte's mind represented more than just helping a friend. It symbolized a rebellion against the constraints that had begun to feel suffocating. She was tired of being told that her every action must be carefully considered for its impact on the monarchy, tired of living according to schedules created by others, and tired of feeling like a spectator in her own life. Emma's crisis had created an opportunity to act independently, to make a real difference in someone's life without the elaborate machinery of royal charity protocols. As the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, Princess Charlotte rose from her bed with a sense of purpose that had been absent for months. The plan forming in her mind was impulsive and potentially reckless, but it felt more authentic than anything she had contemplated in years. She would find a way to help Emma, even if it meant defying the careful structures that governed royal behavior. The consequences of such defiance were unclear, but the alternative, continuing to feel powerless and trapped, had become unbearable. The morning that would change everything was about to begin, and Charlotte felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration that reminded her she was still capable of surprising herself. The royal protocols that had shaped her entire life were about to face their greatest challenge from the most unexpected source. The princess they were designed to protect and guide. As she prepared to face the day ahead, Charlotte carried with her the weight of a decision that would test the very foundations of everything she had been taught about duty, loyalty, and the price of being born into extraordinary circumstances. The morning of what would become known within palace circles as the incident began with deceptive normalcy. Princess Charlotte appeared at breakfast with her usual composed demeanor, though those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tension around her eyes and the way she absently stirred her tea without drinking it. The dining room staff went about their duties with practiced efficiency, unaware that the young woman they served was about to shatter decades of carefully maintained royal protocol. Charlotte's mind raced through the plan she had formulated during the sleepless hours before dawn. The logistics seemed straightforward enough. She would need to access one of the family's discretionary charitable funds, arrange for an immediate transfer to cover Emma's tuition, and do so without triggering the usual approval processes that could take weeks to complete. What she hadn't fully considered were the security implications of acting outside normal channels, or how her protection detail would react to sudden changes in her planned activities. Sergeant Major Williams arrived for the morning briefing with his usual punctuality, carrying files that detailed the day's security arrangements. He had worked royal protection for 15 years, and possessed an intuitive understanding of potential threats that went far beyond his formal training. As he reviewed the princess's schedule, he noticed nothing unusual, but something in Charlotte's demeanor set off subtle alarm bells that he couldn't quite identify. The first scheduled engagement was a visit to St. Mary's Hospital, where Charlotte would meet with young patients in the children's cancer ward. The visit had been planned for months, with every detail carefully coordinated between the palace staff, hospital administration, and security teams. The children and their families were looking forward to the royal visit, with an excitement that their medical teams hoped would provide a meaningful boost to morale during difficult treatments. Charlotte went through the pre-visit briefing with apparent attention, asking appropriate questions about the patients she would meet and the facility's current needs. Mrs. Henderson noticed nothing amiss in the princess's preparation, though she did observe that Charlotte seemed slightly more subdued than usual. The briefing materials included photographs and brief biographies of several children, ranging in age from 5 to 16, each fighting battles that put Charlotte's own struggles into stark perspective. As the royal motorcade prepared for departure, Charlotte made her first deviation from protocol. She quietly asked Williams if they could make a brief stop at the bank after the hospital visit, explaining that she needed to handle some personal banking matters that had been overlooked in the week's planning. Williams hesitated, knowing that unscheduled stops created security complications, but the princess's request seemed innocent enough, and he agreed to contact the bank's security team to arrange appropriate protocols. The hospital visit proceeded exactly as planned, and Charlotte found herself genuinely moved by the courage and resilience of the young patients she met. 7-year-old Sophie, who was undergoing treatment for leukemia, presented Charlotte with a hand-drawn picture of a princess in a crown, complete with a cape and a sword. The drawing's innocent symbolism, a princess as a warrior rather than a passive figure, struck Charlotte with unexpected force. During her conversation with 12-year-old Marcus, who was recovering from brain surgery, Charlotte was struck by his matter-of-fact acceptance of his situation and his excitement about returning to school. His casual mention of the friends who visited him regularly reminded Charlotte of Emma's isolation and desperation, creating an emotional urgency that made her upcoming deception feel not just justified but necessary. The visit to the teenage patients proved especially impactful. 16-year-old Sarah, who had been battling bone cancer for 2 years, spoke eloquently about her determination to attend university despite the interruptions to her education caused by her treatment. Her unwavering focus on her future goals, despite facing far greater obstacles than Emma's financial crisis, reinforced Charlotte's conviction that she needed to act decisively to help her friend. As the hospital visit concluded, Charlotte felt the weight of the contrasts between the courage she had witnessed and her own privileged complaints about royal constraints. These young people faced genuine life-and-death struggles with remarkable grace, while she had been wallowing in self-pity about limitations that suddenly seemed trivial by comparison. This realization didn't diminish her desire to help Emma, but it did provide perspective on the relative importance of protocol violations versus real human need. The motorcade's route to the bank took them through busy London streets, and Charlotte watched ordinary people going about their daily lives with an intensity that concerned Williams. The princess had always been observant during public outings, but today she seemed to be studying the faces of passers-by with unusual concentration, as if trying to memorize what normal life looked like from behind the bulletproof glass of her royal vehicle. At the bank, Charlotte's request to access one of the family's charitable funds triggered exactly the kind of bureaucratic complexity she had hoped to avoid. The bank manager, Mr. Pemberton, explained that while the princess certainly had the authority to make such transactions, the amounts involved required additional documentation and approval processes that could take several days to complete. His respectful but firm adherence to protocol represented everything Charlotte had come to resent about the institutional barriers that separated her from direct action. Charlotte's frustration mounted as Mr. Pemberton detailed the various forms and approvals required for what seemed like a simple transfer of funds that belonged to her family. She found herself arguing with increasing intensity, insisting that the urgency of the situation should override normal procedures. Williams watched this exchange with growing concern, recognizing signs of emotional stress that could lead to more serious problems if not carefully managed. The breaking point came when Mr. Pemberton suggested that Charlotte could expedite the process by having her private secretary contact the palace's financial office to begin the approval process immediately. The thought of involving Mrs. Henderson and the inevitable questions about the recipient and purpose of the funds sent Charlotte into a state of panic that she struggled to conceal. The careful facade of royal composure that had taken years to perfect began to crack under the pressure of her conflicting loyalties and desires. Williams noticed the change in Charlotte's demeanor immediately. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her hands were trembling slightly, and her usual careful articulation had given way to clipped, urgent speech patterns. These were classic signs of acute stress that he had been trained to recognize and respond to, though he had never expected to see them displayed by a member of the royal family during what should have been a routine banking visit. Charlotte excused herself from the meeting and stepped into the bank's private restroom, where she could no longer maintain her composure. The weight of expectation, the urgency of Emma's situation, and the suffocating nature of royal protocol combined to create an emotional crisis that she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she felt completely trapped by circumstances that seemed designed to prevent her from acting according to her conscience and compassion. In the confines of the restroom, Charlotte made the most impulsive decision of her 17 years. She pulled out her personal phone and called Emma directly, explaining in hurried whispers that she was trying to arrange help but facing unexpected complications. Emma's grateful but increasingly desperate response intensified Charlotte's determination to find an immediate solution, regardless of the potential consequences for royal protocol. The conversation with Emma revealed additional complications that made the situation even more urgent. Emma's father had suffered what appeared to be a minor heart attack brought on by the stress of their financial crisis, and was currently in the hospital undergoing tests. The family was now facing not only educational expenses, but mounting medical bills that threatened to destroy them completely. Charlotte felt the weight of these revelations like physical blows, and her determination to help crystallized into a reckless resolve that would soon test every protocol designed to protect her. When Charlotte emerged from the restroom, Williams immediately noticed that something fundamental had changed. The princess's demeanor had shifted from frustrated to determined in a way that sent warning signals through his experienced protective instincts. She approached Mr. Pemberton with renewed intensity, demanding to know if there were any emergency procedures that could expedite the funds transfer without the usual approvals. Her persistence and obvious emotional investment in the transaction raised questions that Williams knew he would eventually need to address with palace security. The bank manager's continued insistence on following proper procedures triggered Charlotte's first serious breach of royal protocol. In a voice loud enough to be heard throughout the bank's private offices, She declared that the monarchy's charitable funds should be able to help people in genuine emergencies without bureaucratic delays that could literally destroy lives. Her passionate outburst drew surprised looks from bank staff and created exactly the kind of public scene that royal protection protocols were designed to prevent. Williams made the difficult decision to intervene, gently but firmly, suggesting that they return to the palace to discuss alternative approaches to Charlotte's charitable concerns. His calm professional demeanor masked his growing alarm at the princess's emotional state, and his recognition that the situation was spiraling beyond normal parameters. The careful balance between protecting Charlotte's personal autonomy and maintaining security protocols was being tested in ways that his training had never fully prepared him for. Charlotte's response to Williams's suggestion marked the moment when her emotional crisis truly began. Instead of accepting his guidance with her usual cooperation, she turned to face him with tears of frustration streaming down her cheeks, and declared that she would not return to the palace until she found a way to help her friend immediately. The sight of the future queen crying in a public building represented a security and protocol nightmare that Williams had to address while maintaining his protective responsibilities. The scene that unfolded in the bank's executive offices would be recounted in hushed tones among palace staff for months afterward. Princess Charlotte, heir to the throne and symbol of royal dignity, stood in the middle of a commercial bank office openly weeping and demanding that centuries of protocol be set aside so she could immediately transfer money to help a friend facing a family crisis. The juxtaposition of royal authority and teenage desperation created a surreal moment that challenged everyone's understanding of how such situations should be handled. Williams's radio call to palace security marked the official beginning of what would become a crisis, requiring intervention at the highest levels of royal administration. His careful choice of words, describing a emotional security concern rather than a breach of protocol, reflected his protective instincts toward Charlotte, as well as his understanding that how this incident was characterized would influence how it was resolved. Within minutes, the palace's crisis management protocols were activated for the first time in recent memory due to the actions of a family member rather than external threats. As additional security personnel were discreetly dispatched to the bank, Charlotte remained unaware that her emotional breakdown had triggered emergency procedures designed to protect both her personal safety and the monarchy's reputation. Her focus remained entirely on finding an immediate solution to Emma's crisis, even as the walls of royal protocol closed in around her with increasing intensity. The next few hours would test not only her resolve, but the flexibility of an institution that had survived for centuries by carefully balancing tradition with the necessity of adaptation to changing circumstances. The emergency call that reached the palace's security control room at 2:47 p.m. would later be marked as the official beginning of what internal documents would refer to as Protocol 7, a rarely used procedure reserved for situations where a member of the royal family faced an immediate crisis that threatened both personal safety and institutional integrity. The duty officer receiving William's carefully coded message understood immediately that Princess Charlotte was in distress and that normal protocols had failed to contain the situation. Within minutes of the alert, a coordinated response began taking shape across multiple departments of the royal household. The princess's private secretary, Mrs. Henderson, was immediately contacted and briefed on the developing situation. Her decades of experience managing royal crises allowed her to quickly assess the potential implications of Charlotte's emotional breakdown and begin implementing damage control measures that could protect both the princess and the monarchy's reputation. Meanwhile, at the bank, Charlotte remained unaware of the escalating response her breakdown had triggered. She sat in Mr. Pemberton's office, alternating between desperate phone calls to Emma and increasingly agitated conversations with bank officials who seemed determined to maintain their procedural requirements regardless of the human cost. Each minute that passed without resolution intensified her conviction that the entire system of royal privilege was designed more to maintain appearances than to help real people facing genuine emergencies. Sergeant Major Williams found himself in the unprecedented position of managing a royal family member who was actively refusing to cooperate with security protocols, while simultaneously experiencing what appeared to be a genuine mental health crisis. His radio communications with Palace Control became increasingly frequent as he struggled to maintain the delicate balance between respecting Charlotte's autonomy and ensuring her safety in an environment that was becoming less controlled by the minute. The bank staff, meanwhile, faced their own unprecedented challenge. Mr. Pemberton had managed high-profile accounts for over 20 years, but he had never encountered a situation where a member of the royal family was emotionally demanding immediate access to funds while surrounded by increasingly nervous security personnel. The presence of additional police officers arriving discreetly at the bank's entrances added an element of surreal tension to what should have been a routine banking transaction. Charlotte's latest conversation with Emma revealed that her friend's father had been admitted to the hospital's cardiac unit for observation, adding a medical emergency to the financial crisis that was driving Charlotte's desperation. Emma's voice, thick with exhaustion and fear, conveyed the kind of real-world urgency that made royal protocol seem not just irrelevant, but actively harmful. Charlotte found herself promising Emma that she would find a solution within hours, a commitment that she had no clear plan to fulfill. The arrival of Deputy Commissioner Harrison from the Royal Protection Unit marked a significant escalation in the palace's response to Charlotte's crisis. Harrison had overseen royal security for 12 years and possessed both the authority and experience necessary to make decisions that could override normal procedures when circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. His calm, professional demeanor masked his concern about the unprecedented nature of Charlotte's breakdown and the potential security implications of her emotional state. Harrison's first action was to meet privately with Charlotte in the bank's conference room, away from the growing number of officials and security personnel who were complicating an already delicate situation. His approach combined the firm authority of a security professional with the gentle understanding of someone who had observed the unique pressures faced by royal family members throughout their lives. He recognized that Charlotte's crisis represented more than simple teenage rebellion. It reflected deeper conflicts between personal values and institutional expectations that required careful handling. The conversation between Harrison and Charlotte would later be described by palace insiders as a turning point in the crisis, though not in the way that anyone expected. Rather than calming the princess or convincing her to return to normal protocols, Harrison's gentle questioning about her motivations and concerns seemed to intensify her emotional state. Charlotte found herself explaining not just Emma's immediate crisis, but her broader frustrations with the constraints and irrelevance of royal life in terms that surprised even herself with their passion and clarity. Harrison listened to Charlotte's emotional outpouring with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes the most effective way to resolve a crisis was to allow it to fully express itself before attempting intervention. Her descriptions of feeling trapped by expectations, guilty about privilege, and powerless to help people she cared about revealed the depth of psychological pressure that had been building beneath her composed royal facade for months, or possibly years. As Charlotte spoke, Harrison began to understand that her breakdown at the bank was merely the visible symptom of a much larger struggle with her role and identity that would require more than security protocols to resolve. Her desperate attempts to help Emma represented a symbolic rebellion against everything she perceived as constraining and artificial about royal life, and addressing the immediate crisis would require acknowledging these deeper concerns rather than simply containing their public expression. The phone call that interrupted their conversation came from Emma herself, and Charlotte answered it immediately, despite Harrison's gentle suggestion that she might want to take a break from the emotionally charged communications that were intensifying her distress. Emma's voice was barely controlled as she explained that the hospital was requiring immediate payment guarantees for her father's continued treatment, adding a medical emergency to the educational and financial crises that were overwhelming the family. Charlotte's reaction to Emma's latest crisis pushed her emotional state beyond anything Harrison had observed in 15 years of royal protection work. The princess began crying with an intensity that suggested complete emotional exhaustion, while simultaneously demanding that Harrison use his authority to override the banking procedures that were preventing her from providing immediate assistance. Her desperation had reached a level that made normal reasoning and protocol considerations seem inadequate to address the situation. Harrison made the decision that would define how the crisis was ultimately resolved. Instead of continuing to work within existing protocols that were clearly failing to address Charlotte's emotional needs, He contacted the palace directly and requested immediate authorization to implement emergency financial assistance procedures that could bypass normal approval processes. His recommendation was based on his assessment that Charlotte's emotional state posed a genuine security risk that could only be resolved by addressing the underlying cause of her distress. The response from the palace came with surprising speed, reflecting the senior staff's understanding that Charlotte's crisis required immediate resolution to prevent potential consequences that could affect the entire royal family. Within 30 minutes, authorization came through for a special emergency fund transfer that could be implemented immediately without the usual documentation and approval processes that had triggered Charlotte's breakdown in the first place. When Harrison informed Charlotte that her request had been approved and that funds could be transferred to Emma's family within the hour, the princess's reaction was unlike anything he had anticipated. Instead of relief or gratitude, Charlotte experienced what appeared to be a delayed shock response, as if the sudden resolution of the crisis had allowed all the emotional tension she had been suppressing to finally surface. She began shaking uncontrollably while trying to call Emma with the good news, her hands trembling too severely to properly operate her phone. The medical evaluation that Harrison quickly arranged revealed that Charlotte was experiencing the physical symptoms of severe acute stress, including elevated heart rate, blood pressure irregularities, and signs of emotional exhaustion that suggested her crisis had been building for much longer than anyone had realized. The royal physician who arrived at the bank recommended immediate rest and observation, concerned that the princess's emotional state indicated deeper psychological stress that would require ongoing attention. Charlotte's insistence on personally confirming the fund transfer and speaking with Emma's family before accepting any medical attention demonstrated the depth of her commitment to seeing the crisis resolved completely. Her conversations with Emma's mother at the hospital revealed the extent to which the family's situation had deteriorated, and Charlotte found herself coordinating not just financial assistance, but additional support services that could help address their multiple overlapping crises. The sight of Princess Charlotte conducting crisis management from a bank conference room, surrounded by security personnel and medical staff, would later be remembered as one of the most unusual scenes in recent royal history. Her transformation from composed royal figure to passionate advocate for her friend's family had revealed aspects of her character that surprised everyone who witnessed it, including palace staff who thought they knew her well after years of careful observation. As evening approached, the immediate crisis had been resolved, but its implications were only beginning to be understood by those responsible for managing royal affairs. Charlotte's breakdown had exposed vulnerabilities in both her personal psychological state and the institutional systems designed to support royal family members that would require careful attention in the days and weeks ahead. The protocols that had been designed to protect and guide her had proven inadequate when faced with genuine moral conflict and emotional crisis. The drive back to Kensington Palace took place in unprecedented circumstances, with Charlotte accompanied by both security personnel and medical staff, who continued to monitor her condition while she made follow-up phone calls to Emma's family. Her relief at having resolved their crisis was evident, but so was an emotional exhaustion that suggested the day's events had drained reserves of strength that had been sustaining her for months. Harrison's debriefing report to palace security would later be studied as an example of how traditional protocols might need to evolve to address the psychological realities faced by modern royal family members. His recommendations included not just immediate support for Charlotte, but broader consideration of how royal duties and expectations might be balanced against personal autonomy and emotional well-being in ways that previous generations had never needed to consider. The evening medical evaluation confirmed that Charlotte's physical symptoms were consistent with severe emotional stress but indicated no lasting health concerns, provided that the underlying psychological pressures were addressed appropriately. The royal physician's report would become the foundation for developing new support systems designed to help royal family members navigate the complex emotional challenges of their unique positions without sacrificing either personal well-being or institutional integrity. As night fell over Kensington Palace, Charlotte finally allowed herself to rest, but her mind continued to process the day's events and their potential implications for her future. The successful resolution of Emma's crisis had demonstrated that it was possible to act decisively within royal constraints when circumstances truly demanded it, but it had also revealed the enormous emotional cost of constantly balancing personal values against institutional expectations. The princess faced difficult questions about how to maintain her sense of identity and purpose while fulfilling the role that had been determined for her before birth. The morning after what palace staff privately called Charlotte's crisis dawned gray and subdued over Kensington Palace, matching the atmosphere that had settled over the royal household as the full implications of the previous day's events began to emerge. Princess Charlotte awoke feeling physically drained but emotionally clearer than she had in months, as if her breakdown had somehow purged the accumulating stress that had been poisoning her relationship with her royal duties. The first person to visit Charlotte was Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a clinical psychologist who specialized in working with high-profile individuals facing unique psychological pressures. Hartwell had been quietly consulting with the royal household for several years, helping to develop support systems for family members dealing with the mental health challenges that could accompany their extraordinary circumstances. Her gentle but direct approach had earned the trust of several royal family members who valued her discretion and practical insights. Charlotte's conversation with Dr. Hartwell revealed the extent to which her emotional crisis had been building over many months of accumulated frustrations and unexpressed concerns about her role and future. The princess described feeling like she was constantly performing a character rather than living an authentic life, and her desperate attempts to help Emma had represented a rare opportunity to act according to her own values rather than predetermined expectations. Dr. Hartwell listened with the skilled attention of someone who understood that Charlotte's breakdown was actually a healthy response to an unhealthy situation. The psychological evaluation confirmed what palace officials had begun to suspect. Charlotte's crisis was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of ongoing stress related to the fundamental conflicts between her personal identity and her royal role. Dr. Hartwell's preliminary recommendations included not just individual therapy for Charlotte, but broader examination of how the royal household could better support young family members navigating the transition from childhood to adult royal responsibilities. Meanwhile, the administrative aftermath of Charlotte's emergency fund transfer was creating ripple effects throughout the palace's financial and legal departments. While the immediate crisis had been resolved, the precedent of bypassing normal approval procedures raised complex questions about protocol, accountability, and the circumstances under which such exceptions might be appropriate in the future. Senior staff found themselves reviewing decades-old procedures that had never been tested by the kind of moral urgency that had driven Charlotte's actions. Emma's phone call that morning brought news that dramatically illustrated why Charlotte's intervention had been so crucial. Emma's father was stable and responding well to treatment, but the family's financial situation had been even more desperate than Emma had initially revealed. Without Charlotte's immediate assistance, Emma would have been forced to withdraw from university within days, and her father's medical treatment would have been seriously compromised by their inability to meet payment requirements. The real-world impact of Charlotte's actions provided powerful justification for her decision to defy protocol. The conversation between Charlotte and Emma took on a different tone than their previous desperate exchanges. Emma's gratitude was overwhelming, but Charlotte found herself more interested in discussing the broader implications of their experience than in accepting thanks for her intervention. She had been deeply affected by her glimpse into the realities faced by ordinary families dealing with medical and financial emergencies, and these insights were reshaping her understanding of what royal privilege could and should mean in practical terms. Charlotte's parents, who had been briefed on the previous day's events during a hastily arranged family conference, arrived at Kensington Palace to discuss the situation with their daughter. The conversation that followed would later be remembered as a turning point in Charlotte's relationship with her royal duties, as her parents demonstrated a level of understanding and flexibility that surprised even Charlotte herself. Rather than focusing on the protocol violations, they encouraged her to explore what her actions revealed about her values and how those values might be better integrated into her royal role. The family discussion revealed that Charlotte's parents had their own concerns about the psychological pressures facing their children as they matured into their royal responsibilities. They had watched Charlotte struggle with increasing anxiety and withdrawal over the past year, but had attributed these changes to normal teenage adjustment rather than deeper conflicts with her role. Charlotte's crisis had forced them to confront the possibility that the traditional approach to royal upbringing might need to evolve to address the emotional needs of young people growing up in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. Dr. Hartwell's presence during the family meeting provided professional perspective on the psychological dynamics that had contributed to Charlotte's breakdown. She explained how the constant pressure to suppress personal desires in favor of institutional expectations could create internal conflicts that eventually manifested in exactly the kind of emotional crisis they had witnessed. Her recommendations focused on finding ways to honor Charlotte's authentic personality and values while still fulfilling her royal obligations. The discussion that emerged from this family meeting would ultimately lead to significant changes in how Charlotte approached her royal duties, but the immediate focus remained on helping her process the emotional aftermath of her breakdown and develop healthier coping strategies for managing the ongoing pressures of royal life. Dr. Tom says, Hartwell suggested that Charlotte's passionate response to Emma's crisis revealed important information about her core values that could be channeled into more fulfilling royal activities if the proper framework could be developed. Charlotte's afternoon was spent reviewing the charitable work that the royal family had been supporting for decades, with particular attention to programs that addressed the kinds of urgent needs that had motivated her desperate actions the previous day. She discovered that the royal household had extensive connections to emergency assistance programs, crisis intervention services, and rapid response charitable initiatives that could provide outlets for her desire to help people facing immediate difficulties. The revelation that effective charitable work was already happening within royal circles, but in ways that Charlotte had never been fully introduced to, illustrated one of the key problems that had contributed to her sense of isolation and irrelevance. Much of the most meaningful royal work happened behind the scenes, away from the ceremonial duties and public appearances that had dominated Charlotte's training and experience. Her crisis had inadvertently revealed gaps in her education about the practical impact of royal influence and resources. Mrs. Henderson's arrival with a revised schedule for Charlotte's upcoming engagements marked the beginning of a new approach to balancing royal duties with personal fulfillment. Instead of the traditional mix of ceremonial appearances and formal charity events, the new schedule included visits to crisis intervention centers, meetings with emergency assistance coordinators, and opportunities to learn about rapid response charitable work that aligned more closely with Charlotte's demonstrated values and interests. The most significant development came in the form of a proposal from the palace's Charitable Affairs Office to create a new Youth Emergency Assistance Fund that would be administered directly by Charlotte, with streamlined procedures that could provide rapid help to young people facing educational, medical, or family crises. The proposal represented an unprecedented level of autonomy for someone Charlotte's age, but her actions had demonstrated both her commitment to such work and her ability to make sound decisions under pressure. Charlotte's response to this proposal revealed how profoundly the previous day's events had affected her perspective on royal life. Instead of viewing the new responsibilities as another burden, she saw them as validation that her instincts about helping people were compatible with her royal role, provided that role could evolve beyond traditional ceremonial functions. Her enthusiasm for developing this new aspect of royal service was the first genuine excitement about royal duties that palace staff had observed in her for months. The administrative challenges of implementing Charlotte's new role proved complex but not insurmountable. Legal experts worked to develop procedures that would allow rapid response to genuine emergencies while maintaining appropriate oversight and accountability. The goal was to create a system that could satisfy Charlotte's desire for meaningful, immediate impact, while protecting both her and the institution from potential abuse or misuse of royal resources. Charlotte's first meeting with crisis intervention professionals provided her with insights into the systemic problems that created the kinds of emergencies she wanted to address. She learned that many families facing sudden medical or financial crises fell through gaps in existing support systems, and that relatively small interventions at the right time could prevent much larger problems from developing. This knowledge helped her understand how her royal resources could be deployed most effectively to create lasting positive change. The evening brought a phone call from Emma with updates on her father's condition and her family's gradual stabilization following Charlotte's intervention. Emma's description of returning to her university studies with renewed focus and determination illustrated the multiplier effect that emergency assistance could have when deployed quickly and appropriately. Charlotte found herself energized by Emma's recovery and motivated to develop systems that could provide similar help to other families facing comparable crises. Hartwell's end-of-day evaluation noted significant improvement in Charlotte's emotional state and stress levels compared to the previous day's assessment. The princess's engagement with developing her new charitable role had provided a constructive outlet for the passionate advocacy that had driven her breakdown, while the family's supportive response had addressed many of the feelings of isolation and misunderstanding that had contributed to her emotional crisis. The security review conducted by Deputy Commissioner Harrison focused on the lessons learned from managing Charlotte's unprecedented breakdown and the implications for future royal protection protocols. His recommendations included enhanced training for security personnel in recognizing and responding to mental health crises, as well as procedures for maintaining safety and dignity when royal family members experienced emotional emergencies in public settings. As Charlotte prepared for sleep, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of 24 hours. The crisis that had seemed so overwhelming the previous morning had ultimately led to opportunities for meaningful engagement with royal duties that she had never imagined possible. Her breakdown had been painful and embarrassing, but it had also been transformative in ways that would influence her approach to royal service for years to come. The precedent set by Charlotte's crisis would eventually influence how the entire royal family approached the balance between personal authenticity and institutional obligations. Her willingness to risk protocol violations in service of genuine human need had demonstrated that the monarchy's relevance in the modern world might depend on its ability to evolve beyond purely ceremonial functions toward more direct and immediate forms of public service. The palace's quiet acknowledgement that Charlotte's actions had been both inappropriate and admirable reflected the complex reality of adapting ancient institutions to contemporary moral and social expectations. The challenge would be developing frameworks that could channel the passion and authenticity that had driven Charlotte's crisis into sustainable forms of royal service that honored both her personal values and her institutional responsibilities. 6 months after the crisis that had shaken Kensington Palace to its foundations, Princess Charlotte stood in the boardroom of the newly established Royal Youth Emergency Fund, reviewing applications for assistance from young people across the United Kingdom who faced circumstances similar to those that had driven her desperate actions that transformative day. The institutional changes that had emerged from her breakdown had exceeded everyone's expectations, creating new models for royal engagement that balanced traditional protocol with genuine responsiveness to urgent human needs. The morning's agenda included cases that illustrated the scope and impact of the program Charlotte had helped design. A brilliant student from Scotland whose family faced deportation, threatening her medical school ambitions. Twin brothers in Wales whose foster placement had fallen through just as they were preparing for university entrance exams. A young mother in Northern Ireland whose abusive relationship had left her homeless with a toddler, unable to complete her nursing qualification. Each case represented the kind of immediate, complex crisis that traditional charitable processes struggled to address quickly enough to prevent lasting damage. Charlotte's approach to reviewing these applications reflected the hard-won wisdom that had emerged from her own crisis experience. Rather than simply approving financial assistance, she worked with a team of social workers, legal advocates, and crisis intervention specialists to develop comprehensive support plans that addressed the underlying systemic problems that had created each emergency. The fund had evolved into something far more sophisticated than anyone had initially envisioned, becoming a model for how modern institutions could respond effectively to contemporary social challenges. The transformation in Charlotte's relationship with her royal duties had been remarkable to observe. Where she had once felt trapped and irrelevant, she now approached each day with genuine enthusiasm for work that aligned with her deepest values. The crisis that had once seemed like a catastrophic breakdown had ultimately revealed her authentic path toward meaningful royal service, demonstrating how apparent failures could become foundations for unexpected success. Dr. Hartwell's continued work with Charlotte had helped the princess develop a sophisticated understanding of how her personal psychological needs could be integrated with her institutional responsibilities. Their sessions had evolved from crisis intervention to strategic planning, focusing on how Charlotte could sustain her passionate engagement with social justice work while maintaining the emotional boundaries necessary for long-term effectiveness. The therapeutic relationship had become a model for supporting other young royals facing similar challenges. The success stories emerging from the Royal Youth Emergency Fund provided powerful validation for Charlotte's instinctive belief that rapid, decisive intervention could transform desperate situations into opportunities for growth and achievement. Emma's graduation from university with honors, followed by her acceptance into a prestigious graduate program, had become a symbol of what was possible when institutional resources were deployed with both compassion and intelligence. Emma's subsequent involvement as a volunteer advisor to the fund had created a feedback loop that ensured the program remained grounded in real-world understanding of the challenges it addressed. Charlotte's relationship with protocol had evolved into something far more nuanced than simple compliance or rebellion. She had learned to work within institutional constraints while pushing boundaries in strategic ways that advanced her goals without triggering unnecessary conflicts. Her experience had taught her that effective advocacy required understanding systems well enough to find pathways for change, rather than simply opposing them from the outside. The international attention that Charlotte's work had attracted had surprised everyone involved with the fund's development. Royal families from other countries had sent delegations to study the program's methods, and several had implemented similar initiatives adapted to their own cultural and legal contexts. Charlotte found herself in the unexpected position of being consulted as an expert on crisis intervention and emergency assistance, roles that no one could have imagined for a teenager just months earlier. The personal growth that Charlotte had experienced through developing and implementing the fund had been as significant as its external impact. Her confidence in her judgment had been strengthened by repeated successful interventions, while her understanding of complex social issues had deepened through direct engagement with families facing multiple overlapping crises. The princess who had once felt powerless and irrelevant had evolved into someone who could navigate complicated bureaucracies and coordinate multi-agency responses to urgent problems. The afternoon brought a visit from Sergeant Major Williams, whose role in Charlotte's life had evolved significantly since the day he had defied protocol to support her emotional breakdown. Their relationship had deepened from professional protection to something approaching mentorship, as Williams had proven uniquely skilled at helping Charlotte balance her passionate advocacy with the practical security and protocol considerations that remained important aspects of royal life. Williams's report on the security implications of Charlotte's expanded public engagement reflected the creative problem-solving that had characterized the palace's response to her transformation. Traditional royal protection had been designed around predictable ceremonial events, but Charlotte's crisis intervention work required rapid response to unpredictable situations in potentially challenging environments. The security team had developed new protocols that maintained safety while allowing Charlotte the flexibility she needed to respond effectively to emergencies. The conversation between Charlotte and Williams illustrated how profoundly their relationship had been changed by the crisis they had navigated together. Williams had learned to recognize and respect Charlotte's moral instincts even when they conflicted with standard procedures, while Charlotte had developed appreciation for the genuine protective concern that motivated security protocols she had once viewed as arbitrary restrictions. Their mutual respect had created a partnership that enhanced both Charlotte's effectiveness and her safety. The evening's engagement represented the kind of royal duty that Charlotte had once dreaded but now approached with genuine enthusiasm. The formal dinner honored volunteers who had contributed to various charitable initiatives, including several people whose lives had been transformed by the Royal Youth Emergency Fund. Charlotte's speech at the event demonstrated her growth as a public speaker, combining royal grace with authentic passion in ways that connected powerfully with her audience. Among the honored guests was Emma's father, whose recovery from his heart attack had been complete, and who had become an advocate for improved support systems for families facing medical emergencies. His presence at the dinner symbolized the full-circle nature of Charlotte's journey from crisis to constructive action, illustrating how her desperate intervention had ultimately created positive change far beyond its original scope. The private conversation between Charlotte and Emma's family after the formal dinner provided an opportunity to reflect on how dramatically everyone's circumstances had changed since that desperate day when Emma's phone call had triggered Charlotte's emotional breakdown. Emma's success in graduate school, her father's recovered health, and the family's financial stability demonstrated the transformative power of timely intervention while Charlotte's development of sustainable systems for providing such intervention illustrated how personal crises could catalyze institutional innovation. Charlotte's evening reflection on the day's activities revealed the depth of satisfaction she had found in work that aligned her royal position with her personal values. The fund's success had demonstrated that effective social change was possible within traditional institutional frameworks, provided those frameworks were willing to evolve in response to contemporary challenges. Her crisis had ultimately taught her that authentic leadership sometimes required breaking rules in service of higher principles, but that sustainable change required building new systems that could institutionalize those principles. The late-night phone call from a crisis intervention coordinator illustrated how Charlotte's role had evolved beyond ceremonial leadership to operational involvement in emergency response systems. A family in crisis needed immediate coordination of housing, medical care, and educational support, and Charlotte's unique position allowed her to facilitate communications between agencies that might otherwise struggle to collaborate effectively. Her willingness to take calls at any hour had become legendary among social service professionals, who had learned to trust her commitment to following through on complex cases. The documentation that Charlotte completed before sleep detailed the systemic patterns she had observed in the cases handled by the fund over its first 6 months of operation. Her analysis would inform policy recommendations that the palace was preparing to present to government agencies, demonstrating how royal influence could be leveraged to advocate for broader social reforms that would address the root causes of the emergencies the fund typically encountered. As Charlotte prepared for bed, she reflected on the profound personal transformation she had experienced since the day when her emotional breakdown had seemed like the end of everything she had been taught about royal behavior. That crisis had actually marked the beginning of a journey toward authentic engagement with her role that had exceeded her most optimistic expectations. The desperate teenager who had cried in a bank office had evolved into a confident advocate who could navigate complex bureaucracies while maintaining genuine compassion for the people she served. The success of Charlotte's transformation had implications that extended far beyond her personal development. Her experience had demonstrated that the monarchy's future relevance might depend on its ability to evolve beyond ceremonial functions toward direct engagement with contemporary social challenges. The institutional changes that had emerged from her crisis suggested pathways for other royal family members to develop meaningful roles that honored both their privileged positions and their personal values. The precedent established by Charlotte's journey from breakdown to breakthrough had begun to influence discussions about how other young royals might navigate the transition from childhood to adult responsibilities. Her experience suggested that authentic engagement with royal duties required opportunities for personal expression and meaningful impact that went beyond traditional ceremonial requirements. The challenge would be developing individualized approaches that allowed each family member to find their own pathway toward purposeful royal service. The long-term implications of Charlotte's transformation remained to be fully understood, but the early evidence suggested that her crisis had catalyzed innovations that would influence royal service for generations to come. Her willingness to risk everything in service of helping a friend had ultimately revealed new possibilities for how ancient institutions could adapt to serve contemporary needs while maintaining their essential character and dignity. The desperate breakdown that had once seemed so destructive had become the foundation for a more authentic and effective approach to royal leadership that honored both tradition and the urgent demands of modern social justice.